Podcast.
All right, I think
I
this
think
is
we are
live
live.
now. Yes, it's showing up on my screen as well. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this uh, new Sanglap Considerations event. Just a few words on Sanglap and Considerations before we get back to our event today. Uh, Sanglap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Inquiry, was founded by Orko Chattopadhyay, who you can see on screen already, and myself, Shorit Bhattacharya. We founded it in 2014 as sort of an exercise in literary and cultural sort of scholarship that we also thought at that point of time as PhD students based in two different countries that we could also communicate not only between ourselves but of course along with and across young scholars and early career academics. That was the point of founding Sanglap, which has gained strength year by year, and now we are not only a journal but also we also have this visual scholarship platform. Now, Sanglap started as a journal only with articles and on themed issues, as in we would only publish biannually two issues every year based on specific themes, because we thought those themes were not only important, contemporary, but also had fundamental relevance to societies and cultures across the globe. And then we started to introduce spatial issues as well, edited by guest editors. And we have continued that tradition for the past 2 to 3 years with one themed issue and one special issue. Over the years, we have also introduced newer sections on reviews, more recently on translations. There is another section on opinions as critical perspectives or opinions to be launched very soon. Um, More recently, almost as a response or in the wake of the COVID 19 pandemic from the summer of April 2020 onwards, when it was possible to talk to people across platforms, especially on visual media, um, because of the possibilities of conversations, digital conversations. We also thought to bring out a virtual edition of Sanglap where we could speak with we could speak with scholars and academics and non-academics, public bodies, to talk about their experiences of publishing, writing, and scholarship, especially in the field of academia, um, as a response to the pandemic. And then we have expanded that to more general conversation, especially about book talks and panels. So Considerations was born as um, as a response to that in the March in the summers of 2020, and we have been able to hold monthly discussions for the past 5 or 6 months, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Jean-Michel Rabaté on Sanglap, and who will be, of course, introduced more formally by my colleague here, Orko. So, just with that in mind, I would like to hand it now over to Orko to introduce our speaker and to continue with the conversation, which I'm sure will be absolutely fantastic for our audience and viewers. Thank you so much for viewing, and over to Orko now.
Thank you, Shorit, and thank you so much for everyone who's joined us today. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have Professor Jean-Michel Rabaté here with us to discuss his most recent book that I will very soon show you the cover of. I mean, using the digital technologies that we are utilizing these days. But before that, let me make an attempt to formally introduce Professor Rabaté, who definitely, as the saying goes, does not need any introduction, especially to anyone who's working in the field of modernist literary studies. But nevertheless, let me try. So, Professor Jean-Michel Rabaté is a professor of English and comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the founders and curators of Slot Foundation in Philadelphia. He is a managing editor of the Journal of Modern Literature. Since 2008, he has been a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Rabaté has authored and edited more than 40 books on modernism, psychoanalysis, contemporary art, philosophy, and writers like Beckett, Pound, and Joyce. Some of his recent books include L'Accord Literario, 2007, The Cradle of Modernism, which has had a Chinese translation, by the way, The Ethic of the Lie, État donné, The Ghosts of Modernity. More recently, has edited Handbook of Modernism Studies and a new French translation of Joyce's play Exiles. And to continue, he has written books like Crimes of the Future, Cambridge Introduction to Literature and Psychoanalysis, The Pathos of Distance. Again, more recently, Think Big, Beckett and the Limit of the Human. And most recently, this book on Beckett and Sade that we will be talking about today. So let me just quickly share my screen once so that I could show you the cover image of the book, if I may. Uh, I don't know whether my screen is visible. I guess it is. And I
Yes.
think I just maximize it once so that you can see. So this is a series called Cambridge Elements, and a series of Beckett books are coming out as part of this Cambridge Elements Beckett series. And Jean-Michel has written this book. It has come out very recently in the last few months on Beckett and Sade. So today it's our pleasure and honor, as I said, to welcome Professor Jean-Michel Rabaté. I Let me just stop sharing. And so the way we will do this is I will ask just a few elementary questions and give it over to him to respond, and we'll have a conversation about this very interesting book. So just to welcome you, Professor Rabate, first, and if I may ask the first question, so I was uh, just to set the ball rolling, if we could talk a little bit about what you call the so-called Sade boom in the book, and this the fact that in the 30s and 40s, growing into the 50s, in the middle of the 20th century, especially for the French avant-garde modernists, Marquis de Sade's works became a very attractive and a very important and a very penetrating source on many accounts. And Beckett had, as you show in the book, a very complicated and ambivalent relationship with this Sade boom. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about this context, and
Yes,
yeah, over to you.
absolutely. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation that honors me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. And I wanted to say that this new series, Elements in Beckett Studies, is made up of relatively short books that introduce one single issue. And in this case, it's something I've worked on for a long time, but had never taken the trouble to synthesize and try to understand, as you said, this complex interaction between Beckett and Marquis de Sade. And you quoted that it's a later letter in which, in the 70s, Beckett would say, "Oh, in fact, I was part of the Sade boom." And it is indeed something that's a little surprising. Why should somebody as dangerous, pornographic, and you might say isolated as Marquis de Sade enjoys such a reputation in France still today? And how was Beckett part of this fascination? This is why my book had to be chronological in a sense, because what I saw is that Beckett very early, when he started working with French culture, knew of Marquis de Sade, but hadn't really read him. Then in 1938, was going to translate the most sulfurous book by Sade, The 120 Days of Sodom. And after the Second World War, while in Paris, was this time much more interested, I would say, philosophically in Sade's work. And this is when he would often meet Georges Bataille. He met after the war, and Georges Bataille had already written a lot on Marquis de Sade before the war. And he was interested in the work of Maurice Blanchot, a very important critic who wrote the best books and best essays on Marquis de Sade. And there was also Simone de Beauvoir, who in 1951 wrote a little pamphlet, Should One Burn Marquis de Sade? The very fact that she could pose a question is interesting. And so then Beckett went on working with Sade, although he never translated a whole book, but he translated several passages for the Little Review transition. And he remained fascinated with Marquis de Sade all his life, from, I would say, the early 20s when he hadn't really read him to the end of his life. And he kept, which is interesting, in his library until the end, a very little short book by Guillaume Apollinaire that was an introduction to the works of Marquis de Sade. Éric Marty, a French scholar, has published a book very recently, a little aggressive facing Sade. And he asked, why has the 20th century taken Sade so seriously? And he's trying to see whether it is deserved or not. Why should Marquis de Sade be taken as more than just an 18th century pornographer? And indeed, one has, I think, to look at Maurice Blanchot. And as we know, people who may have read through Beckett's letters will remember that Beckett was always extremely impressed by Blanchot. And it was in Blanchot that he found an answer to that question. It is the bizarre link in Marquis de Sade between reason and unreason. See, that's what fascinated Beckett. So for Beckett, Sade was not just a pornographer, he was a writer of excess, and the excess of reason that transforms itself into unreason. We can return to that if you want, but I will stop with that first notion that in Maurice Blanchot's words, Marquis de Sade posits a rule, a universal rule that is impossible to follow, which would be a sort of, as he says, a declaration of the rights of eroticism, meaning that every person, every man, every woman has a right to seize and torture whoever they want, which of course is an impossible universalism.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you so much. So maybe to follow up on that, and I know you talk about this in the book as well. So maybe we could begin with this idea. What do you think about Sade and this particular reputation of Sade as a pornographic writer? Because I remember you sort of clarify this at various points in the book, that how Sade is so much more, and perhaps not even a pornographic writer, because he's too scatological to be pornographic, and one doesn't really get pleasure. I think you use the word emetic in the book to sort of describe the kind of sexual politics we see. So maybe we could start a little bit to stay with the Sade part of the puzzle. Yeah.
Yes, you're right. I mean, in fact, it's only now in France, very in the last 2 decades, that Marquis de Sade has been published in the prestigious Pléiade series with Gallimard. And people now can see how varied he was. And in fact, interestingly, this is how he was presented at first by someone like Guillaume Apollinaire. And I think this is why Beckett kept that little book, because Apollinaire, who was also at times a pornographer, wrote a number of erotic novels, but understood that Sade was a great writer and he can be extremely witty and funny. And he also saw himself as a playwright much more than a novelist. But of course, we need to know a little bit about Sade's life. And what is well known is that he himself started out as a very, you might say, famous scion of a very old family in France. The family de Sade could be traced back to Laure, Petrarca's lover in the south of France. He had a beautiful castle that was destroyed during the revolution, Lacoste, where near, not far from where Petrarca would go and pay homage to Laure, who was a sort of ancestor. And Sade was simply like many libertines of the ancient regime. And then, because he did a number of things that were, even for the times, not acceptable, like having, he would hire prostitutes and organize orgies, and some prostitutes complained. And he had an affair with the sister of his wife. So his wife's mother was absolutely intent on stopping him and managed to have him jailed. And he went to a number of jails, La Bastille. And it is while he was in jail, and he spent most of his life in jail, that he wrote the most shocking books, especially the 120 Days of Sodom. And there he unleashes a sort of a dark Gothic streak, and it's all about tortures and killing and maiming people and so on. But if we consider the whole bulk of his works and the collected works in French, I have one version is like 40 books. Huh? He wrote a lot because he was always in a cell, and the only thing he could do was write. This is only 1/10 of his production. And at the end of his life, when Napoleon took over, he made sure that Sade would again be sent to a jail, and then he was sent to an asylum in Charenton. And I return to that because this is the moment when Beckett intervenes a last time in the picture of Marquis de Sade during the Napoleon years, when he was in that asylum of Charenton and writing plays and having the inmates perform those plays, which is quite an amazing moment in his career. And these plays were just plays. There were nothing pornographic about them. So it's very difficult to assess where Sade was, and many writers, even Blanchot, don't take into account the lighter side of Marquis de Sade. And so an extremely varied writer, but somebody who felt that because of the constant isolation and imprisonment, was led to darker and darker fantasies. But at the end of his life, Beckett had to intervene when Peter Weiss had in London and then in New York Marat Sade, a play that was famous then that Beckett didn't like. I retrace that. But for that play, he took that moment, which is historically true, when Marquis de Sade was allowed, invented, you might say, a practice of therapy by theater. And he cured indeed a number of inmates who were were psychotic by having them play every day in plays. He would write for them, and then people would come, and there was a huge audience because Sade was already rather famous then.
Yeah, thank you so much. So to maybe continue with that streak, in fact, one of the very interesting things that uh, you do in the book touch upon is this very interesting connection that at least as someone who is interested in the mathematical question in Beckett, I could take out from the book that there's a certain vision of excess in Sade, but he's, as to go back to one of the initial points you were making, he's always using tools of reason, and there's a certain tendency towards mathematical calculations in these works, 120 Days of Sodom as well, which Beckett was planning to translate, as we know. And there could be a connection between Beckett and Sade on this mathematical aspect as well, and this how to mathematize excess. I think that's one of the things that you suggest in the book. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about this aspect of calculation and mathematics, which possibly Beckett could have, derived from Sade, among other writers. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is what Beckett felt when he was asked whether he could translate the 120 Days of Sodom. And again, I insist that this is a sort of extreme case in his production, but there you have a mathematical construction of the passions that for Beckett immediately called up Dante. And one of his readings, his keys for his readings, was this link between the Inferno of Dante and Sade's dungeons in the 120 Days of Sodom, in which you have a complicated calculations of four libertines with who hire young, strong men, and then women who will tell stories, and then a given number of victims that they will torture and kill, and so on. And so Sade was always interested in that kind of exhaustion of a combinatory of all the possible tortures and passions and so on. Beckett liked that very much, and I think it was at the time of What that he was also working on this idea of series that he would then completely write down and exhaust. And you find that a little bit in Marquis de Sade, who wrote, and I have to say, it is quite extraordinary, this even the manuscript aspect of that book. It was written in 37 days by Sade, 120 Days of Sodom, and he had glued together 33 big leaves to make a huge roll. And he wrote like sort of toilet paper, you might say, and he called it with some irony, La Grande Bande, which means the big scroll or the big erection. And happily for him, he lost it because Marquis de Sade had written this in the Bastille, and that was in 1785. But in 1789, the French Revolution happened, and he was transferred just a few days before the Bastille was taken, and he thought he lost it, and he was despaired because this was really for him his masterpiece. And strangely enough, the manuscript surfaced only in 1904. It had disappeared almost for a century, and was then seen as a sort of pathological document. But it is indeed one of the moments when Sade, who liked counting, he believed in numerology and sort of practice by which his days were somehow counted and so on. Of course, when you're in jail all the time, you count the days, and this is what he did. We can now see this manuscript finally is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It was shown at a show on L'Enfer, the prohibited books that you have in many libraries. And it is connected, of course, with that question of the revolution as well. Sade would say, you thought I would be tamed by being in jail. On the contrary, you made me go to the extreme possibilities of my fantasies. That's how he brought something to Beckett, who could connect what would be the most mathematical, you might say, on the one hand, and the parody of logics, a parody of rationality, using a sort of libidinal explosion, which is the case for this book.
Right, right. Thank you. So maybe to continue and perhaps to go back to one of the threads you had opened up earlier, it's very interesting how we see similarities there between Sade doing these plays with the inmates in Charenton and Beckett working with the San Quentin prisoners. And I'm wondering whether in certain ways, all through his life, there were these points of identification for Beckett when it came to the figure of Sade. And it's interesting how you throughout the book chart all these different contexts and how they produce different readings of Sade. So we may begin with things like sexuality, but we end with a more political vision of jouissance, as you show in the latter half of the book. But maybe to sort of again go back to that connection between Sade and revolution and what Beckett would have picked up from there, because that's the weaving in the book where you know go back to the way Beckett would respond to Mara Sade and its politics, and not quite uh, a- approve of this idea of Sade as a non-revolutionary. Sade was a revolutionary for Beckett in certain ways. So if you could possibly elaborate on that a little bit, that would be
Yeah,
great.
yeah, that's one aspect I worked a lot on, and I discovered this a little by something that was symptomatic, which was the fact that in 1964, to be precise, Beckett was very close to an Irish actor, Patrick Magee, who he liked a lot. So Patrick Magee was chosen to become Marquis de Sade in Peter Weiss's play Mara Sade, staged by Peter Brook. I saw that play many times and I love it. And I was absolutely surprised to see that Beckett did not like it at all. And I thought, why is that? And everybody who reports on it says that it was a triumph. It did extremely well. It garnered all the prizes in London and New York. And it is an amazing play, I have to say, with participation of the audience and so on. However, the little detail that attracted my attention was that Beckett, who had his misgivings, gave 3 books to Magee to read in preparation for this role. One of them was a book that he didn't own, but a friend of his had, and I believe that he had read it because what he writes about Sade, this is a book from 1934, The Revolutionary Ideas of the Marquis de Sade by Geoffrey Gorer. I read that book and I found it extremely interesting. And I could really imagine that Beckett knew it because it explains his reactions to the French critics like Klossowski or Bataille and Blanchot. When we see him decide who is a good critic and who understands Marquis de Sade and who does not. What was Gorer's main idea? His idea, as the title explains, was that Sade was a revolutionary. What does that mean? We know indeed that Marquis de Sade, after the seizure of the Bastille, was freed and was indeed for a while in La Section des Piques. And it was one of the most radical left wing, you might say, groups of the French Revolution. At the same time, Marquis de Sade, and so this is really an important detail that Gorer highlights, when he had the opportunity to get his revenge, that is, that his mother-in-law, who had been horrible to him and sent him to jail, came in front of the tribunal, and at a time when nobles were beheaded like that, 300 or 400 a day, he could have signed the death warrant, and he didn't. He could not do it, which is interesting because you could imagine anybody would be a little sadist, say, okay, great, I have my revenge, off with their heads. He didn't do it. So this is something that you find in Peter Weiss's play. At some point, we see the character Sade, and that's quite historical, say, no, no, I couldn't do it. And indeed, Sade was totally devastated when it happened to be before uh, seeing the executions and mass decapitations. He couldn't take it. So he was not a sadist in the banal sense of the word. But, so the point is this, in Peter Weiss' portrayal, Marquis de Sade is presented as somebody who still belongs to the ancient regime, still seen as a perverse noble who doesn't understand the revolution. If one follows, on the other hand, Geoffrey Gorer's book, this is not true. And Gorer makes a simple point, which had been actually made by one of the best specialists of Sade, Maurice Heine, who was the first to publish Sade's text accurately, scientifically, and so on in the 30s, which is, why should one identify Marquis de Sade with these characters, which is what all the other critics do. In Marquis de Sade, you have all those ferocious libertines and so on. And indeed, they have often different perspectives and so on. What Gorer and Heine say, Sade functions like a playwright. He stages all those horrible people, often women, who are more bloodthirsty than the men quite often. But it doesn't mean that he himself is saying, yes, yes, you are right. And Gorer shows that partly, and I think he had a point, the French Revolution came about because of Marquis de Sade. The reason why he lost his manuscript was that he had to be transferred away from the Bastille. Why? Because a few days before the Bastille, July 14th, that is our French national, every year, July 14th, national celebration of the French Revolution by this single moment that is identified, the capture and destruction of that fortress, the Bastille, in the middle of Paris, where Sade had been pent up for a while. He opened his window and he started screaming, Marquis de Sade, come, free us, they are cutting our throats, which was not true. But he launched something, and then they immediately took him away. But a few days later, they destroyed that huge fortress. So that's a little detail about the history of the French Revolution, in which you see Marquis de Sade directly as a major actor. And then the play by Peter Weiss is on Marat, a revolutionary who had been stabbed by a young woman, Charlotte Corday, and there was a huge ceremony for Marat after his death, and it was indeed Marquis de Sade who wrote a speech and was officially in charge of the funeral and so on. So he was really within the French Revolution. But, and this is not something that Peter Weiss explains, because of his leniency to the in-laws and so on, he was considered as too moderate, and he was going to be executed. He would have been executed if the deux terminors, as we said, tell me the moment when the Montagnards were themselves killed didn't happen. So he was saved at the last minute, and he had seen firsthand what the French Revolution had been, the fight between the Montagnards and the Girondins. Charlotte Corday, who killed Marat, was friend with the Girondins, and she wanted to avenge the Girondins. And so on, against Robespierre and Saint-Just. So Sade was really in the midst of this moment that was the moment of the terror, when the French Revolution got out of control and started executing people right and left. And interestingly, we can see that he had his own political moment. He wrote a number of political pamphlets that are still amazing. Frenchman, Another Effort, and so on. They are among the most revolutionary texts one can find, I would say. And so I agree with Gorer, and I think that Beckett understood how Gorer saw better than Peter Weiss. Peter Weiss is obliged, he has a sort of Marxist take, you might say, and is obliged to see Marquis de Sade as a sort of old regime pervert who has a sense of, you might say, erotic liberation, but has no political sense. And is obliged to have a number of characters that he adds totally against the chronology, who are supposed to embody a better, almost socialist sense of the French Revolution. And so this is, I think, what Beckett did not like in that play. And it's, of course, it would be, as you said, Arka, very interesting to see the function of the theater for Beckett, which is, as you said, exactly similar to the function of the theater for Marquis de Sade. Sade's ambition was not to be the best pornographer in the world, but to be a famous playwright. See? And he finally found, or he invented, you might say, a technique that is still used at times in certain mental hospitals, which is the use of play acting. And he managed to have all the inmates of the Charenton hospital play every night, act every night on the stage, and so on. So that's something similar to Beckett's practice of the theater. And we know that Beckett came at the theater by in moments when he started first writing a draft of a play that was not very successful, on human wishes on the 18th century. Then he wrote Eleutheria in French, and it was not so successful. And finally, there was Godot, and one can say that Godot launched Beckett for the French public, at least. But Godot, what is interesting is that Godot was a play that he just wrote as he was completing a very dark piece of work, the trilogy between Malone Dies and The Unnameable. And then Beckett discovered that he could write plays, and he went on and he became more famous via the theater. But there is still this tension, I think, within the Beckettian corpus between the novels and the text in very opaque prose and the slightly, one can say, minimalist theater of Beckett. We could return to that. It's a huge topic, but thank you for sending to me.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. So to continue, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about how this book also opens up a connection between a figure like Beckett and someone like Artaud, who again is I mean, you mentioned Artaud and you mentioned the connections there. So I was wondering in what ways Beckett's theater would differ from the kind of theater of cruelty formulation, which would have more of an explicit Sadian reference. And I'm just wondering how Beckett would position himself, because as you showed in the first half of the book, especially in the letters, the early letters from the 30s, Beckett did have his hesitation when it came to sort of identifying with Sade and identifying himself as part of the Sade boom. And he was also a little bit worried at one point whether he would at all get publishers if he, completely identified with that the Sade group, as it were. So I was just wondering if you could talk to that a little bit more. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. As you know, Beckett had already created quite a splash in Dublin. We have to remember that Dublin, or that island at that time, was so Catholic and so reserved about sexuality and so on. Beckett's title for his first collection of short stories, More Pricks Than Kicks, was seen as obscene. And so Beckett had a bad reputation in in Ireland, And indeed, he thought that if he were to translate the 120 Days of Sodom, a book which I have to say still today will shock absolutely anybody who opens it, especially the ending. The last section is really about cruel tortures and tortures and tortures and tortures, to the point that it is indeed a little bit sickening. I have to say that I myself have read a lot of Sade over the years, but for this book, I had to reread a lot. And then there's a moment when you have to say, no, I cannot. Let's stop here. And Beckett felt that. Um, but he was conscious that if he was seen as a sort of pornographer, it would not be good for him. And he wanted to succeed very much, Beckett, I think, as a writer in the 30s when Murphy was being published and so on. He had been seen as Joyce's secretary and being too Joycean. But if on top of that he had been Joycean and Sadian, it would have been too much. But at the same time, what is interesting, and this is what is difficult with Beckett, I think, today, is that he has this double culture. He was an Irishman who had come to Paris to work at the École Normale Supérieure, and he became Joyce's friend, real friend. He could have become Joyce's son-in-law at the married Joyce's daughter, which was Joyce's own plan. That didn't work out. But it was a time when Beckett, when he was introduced to the French milieu, and he slowly became a French writer, was introduced to literature via Joyce and via a group of friends of Joyce around Eugène and Maria Jolas in transition. And one can say, most critics who have been working on Beckett accept this idea, that Beckett was a sort of surrealist, or he was part of a group that had a lot of affinities with the surrealists. And they were generally in transition. You had often texts by the surrealists and so on. What kind of surrealism? Surrealism had at that time exploded, and you mentioned Antonin Artaud. You know that Antonin Artaud was originally part of the surrealist group, but he was quickly expelled by André Breton. Why? It seems incredible today, because André Breton believed that the theater was bourgeois and that one should not do anything with the theater. In the same way, Soupeau, a good friend of Breton, was expelled because he was doing journalism. Journalism was prohibited, and so on. André Breton was a sort of dictator. And it is interesting for me to see that the group of the people who had been excluded one after the other gathered, and one of those who would be the spearhead of the anti-Breton attack was Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille became a friend of Beckett after the war. In the 30s, Bataille would use Marquis de Sade as a name and as a set of texts to criticize what he called André Breton's idealism. Because André Breton, in the first manifesto of surrealism, had claimed that Sade was surrealism in sadism, which doesn't say much. But Bataille, who had read Marquis de Sade more closely, saw in Sade something that he perhaps exaggerated a little bit, was pure materialism. At least what he saw in Sade, and that was very important in the few texts written by Georges Bataille in the 30s about the use value of Marquis de Sade for the revolution. At the same time as Gorer was writing, and my guess is that Geoffrey Gorer had read some of Bataille's essays because it's very, very similar. The idea is that Marquis de Sade is a real revolutionary because he's not an idealist and because he goes to the end of something. This is Bataille's major concept, the concept of excess. And that is indeed what you find in some texts of Sade, especially 120 days, that excess is limitless, and therefore that the revolution should not stop. That was one of the questions Sade posed to the revolution. Why not go further? Why not destroy more? Um, Quite an interesting question. So I wanted to simply say this, that at that time, Sade was a sort of wedge between the various factions of the surrealists. And then Antonin Artaud, as we know, when he launched his little theater, André Breton and his friends came and destroyed it. Artaud had to call the police, which for uh, Breton was a sign that he was on the side of the police, and so on. When Artaud launched this idea of the theater of cruelty, in the first proposal for what he called the theater of cruelty, of course, he was thinking of Marquis de Sade, and he had planned to stage one text by Sade. We don't know which. So this idea of cruelty is not exactly typically Sadian, but it is this idea that you need to have the sense of risk, that the bodies of the actors can be at risk, and that intensity will be somehow conveyed to the audience. What is the link between Artaud and Beckett? It is the group of the actors like Blin who first performed Waiting en attendant Godot in French, Waiting for Godot. They had worked with Artaud. See, so there is a continuity here between Artaud, Sade, and Blin, Beckett, and so on.
I was, yeah, that to kind of again continue a little bit further with the historical context of uh, Sade, in a way having this appeal for post-war French literature. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, especially how Beckett uses that sort of amoral imagination of Sade as a writer. And again, I'm also thinking of certain kinds of works that have been done around the question of ethics in Beckett studies, especially this idea of the unethical, and whether or not, in certain ways, when we talk about the violence that Beckett picks up, maybe in a text like How It Is from Sade, as you suggest in the book, uh, there are these very interesting intersections with ethics and love as well. I mean, passing through Badiou's reading of How It Is as this break with solipsism and the opening towards the other. So, in a certain way, there's this pathos of violence that marks the relationship with the other, as it were. And I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about this question of violence and how that connects these two writers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, thank you. That's a great question. Uh, in what Sade offers, if we go back to this very strong idea of Maurice Blanchot, he gives us a law that everybody can enjoy the bodies of the others as they want and without any limit. What Blanchot shows is that this is an impossible law. It is a law of ethics, if you want, that uh, shows the limit of universalism in ethics. So this is something that Lacan had well seen in his seminar on ethics. And then Lacan went on when he wrote that fantastic essay with Kant, with Sade. Okay. And what Lacan shows very clearly is that Kant is the reverse of Marquis de Sade, and Sade is the reverse of Kant. This is an idea that for most people who know a little bit philosophy in the 20th century is attributed to Adorno and Horkheimer. Uh, Adorno and Horkheimer, and I was always interested by the parallel that Adorno and Horkheimer were in exile in California when they wrote together the dialectic of enlightenment, in the same way as Beckett was in hiding in the south of France in Roussillon when he was writing What, which is very Kantian and very Sadian, they had this idea, which is a very strong idea, that Marquis de Sade is the reverse of Kant. Why? Because what they see, very critical of Kant, is that in Kant you have a sort of law without any affect. The law has to be pure, and you obey the law without thinking of people. And it's the same thing in Marquis de Sade, that you can take all the victims and so on and do what you want. If it is your enjoyment, this is fine. When Beckett went on, and the text that is the most disturbing, and the text in which sadism is quite explicitly named and so on, is How It Is Commencé of the 60s. And so there you have this idea of people, one character called Pym, who is torturing another man to make him sing and to make him tell stories and so on. At the same time, this torture is identified with love. See? So this is where Beckett appears as a sort of post-Sadian in his most disquieting book, I would say, How It Is, especially the central section, where we see graphically the tortures, the hero, I mean the narrator, as a can opener, and the savages, the anus of this other man, and he asks him, "Do you love me, cunt?" and so on. It's very ferocious, and nobody knows exactly what to make of that scene and so on. Is it real? Is it a fantasy? Is it just people being in hell? Is it sort of Dantean hell? Are they crawling in the mud and so on? But you have really a sort of series of sadistic fantasies in which, at the same time, it is mediated by this idea that there is a reversibility, that then the person who tortures will be tortured in his turn by another one in the dark, in the mud, and so on. It's a sort of meta-sadism, you might say, a meditation on love as torture. And here I would perhaps suggest that this is to be connected with what Beckett, that's why I was mentioning Lacan. For Lacan, Marquis de Sade is absolutely central for any meditation on ethics. Why? And if you, I'll just give you that little detail which comes from the seminar on ethics. Lacan quotes a passage in Kant's second critique, in which Kant imagines that if a man who is absolutely in love with a woman and is ready to do anything to sleep with her were to spend the night with her, but he would see the rope that would hang him in the morning, he would not do it. This is what Kant assumes. Lacan, who has seen pathological cases, says, on the contrary, there are many people who would be ready to sleep with that woman and maybe kill her, why not, and then be hanged in the morning. And he accuses Kant of not going to the end of his logic, while Sade would go to the end of this logic. That's in the seminar on ethics. What Lacan sees is that prevalence of a certain sadism in that psychoanalysis shows. In Beckett's own case, I'm not sure that he knew what Lacan has written on Marquis de Sade, although he could have. He knew vaguely of Lacan. They were, after all, living in Paris and so on. Had Beckett read Adorno or Keimer, it's a possibility too, or heard of them. But what is sure is that Beckett had underwent psychoanalysis with Bion in London in the 30s. Bion became a very famous psychoanalyst later on. Bion belonged to the school of Melanie Klein. If you read Melanie Klein, especially the Melanie Klein of the 30s, it's sadism all the time. What Melanie Klein shows, extrapolates, because after all, we don't know very much about that, is that in the first months of an infant's life, there is an unleashing of sadism. She imagines that a little infant will want to destroy, to rip up the mother's womb, break her body, and so on, and full of violence. And she called this a sadistic moment. We know that Beckett knew a lot about that and had meditated on his own link with his mother and his mother's love and his own sadism, her own sadism. So this is part of Beckett's, I would say, self-analysis that he continued, because Bion may not have helped him that much, but at least a little bit. Bion allowed him to go back to finish Murphy and publish Murphy and so on. But we can say that Beckett went on psycholizing himself by writing, and this is a question that he kept throughout his life, that question of the links between sadism and love.
Thank you. That really clarifies a lot of these connections. Uh, Maybe one last question before we can open it up to audience questions, and I would also take this opportunity to invite questions from YouTube. Whoever is watching us, please feel free. I can see James has already written a question, but others, please come up with your own questions. And maybe I'll ask one final question, Jean-Michel, if that's fine with you. Okay. And this is a little bit in a different direction, because I know that you don't do this in this book, but I'm just curious to know your thoughts on this. What happens when we read back Sade from Beckett's own creative interpretations? I say creative because, of course, not that he always writes on Sade, though he writes on Proust, and you make that connection in the book, how Proust and Sade have something to say to one another, and there's a certain Sadian aspect in Proust as well. But I'm just wondering, when we, especially in the light of the readings that you do of the late plays as well, what were at the end, of course, how it is, but going back to novels like Murphy and the French short stories in the middle. So when we look back at Sade from this Beckettian vantage point and his own extrapolations from Sade as a writer, is there a possibility of a Beckettian reading of Sade in the other way, sort of in the other direction? I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question. Um, I was surprised, and I discovered this writing this book, to see that Beckett didn't like the work of Pierre Klossowski. And I was surprised by that. And of course, unhappily, Klossowski's first essays on Sade have not been translated into English. But as early as in the 30s, he was writing a lot on Marquis de Sade from a psychoanalytic point of view. But Klossowski imagines that in Sade, you have a sort of evil God, that the enjoyment of this evil God is what the libertine wants to achieve. And I think this is a good starting point to understand at least the excess of the 120 Days of Sodom and Juliette and Justine, those two long novels. In It seems that nevertheless, Beckett knew those texts, and he said, "Oh no, Blanchot is much better, Klossowski, hogwash, and so on." This is part of the complex debate around the meaning of Marquis de Sade. Again, my solution to that debate is to follow Gorer's or Heine's view, which is that you will never find a system that can reconcile all the points of view of all the libertines in Sade's system, because they are characters. He is not behind them. He gives them at times a sort of anti-theology, as in some cases taken by Klossowski, perhaps too much as the key to Sade, but other characters are totally opposed to any mention of God and so on. And so theology or atheology is not necessarily the main element in Sade's works. See, and this is where I think Beckett refused Klossowski's idea, but took Blanchot's more, I would say, rationalistic or irrationalistic theory that Blanchot shows that what is fascinating in Marquis de Sade is that he is always reasoning. In all the novels, especially Justine, Juliet, 120 Days, or in the philosophy in the bedroom, you have constantly scenes of orgies, deprivation, tortures, and then one libertine will talk, and have a long system that will be either we need to be more ferocious than nature. Nature teaches us that we can kill anybody. There is no pity in nature. There are catastrophes and so on. And then in another text, he will say, oh, but we need to destroy nature, to outrage nature, to go against nature. Complete contradiction. See, and those contradictions are fascinating. They led Beckett to this recurrent motive in his own works, that what he wants to attack is this idea of reason, which is an 18th century construct that it is also the aim of Sade to attack. See, so here we have a rereading of Sade via Beckett, not only Beckett, but Blanchot, Bataille, Lacan, Beckett, being on same wavelengths and allowing to understand Sade not just as a sort of weird theologian, but as somebody who understands the power of reason to undo reason.
Thank you so much. So maybe we could take the questions from the floor now, and just to see, I'm just so what I would do is I would read out the question, but I'll also show it here. It's a three-part question coming from James, and greetings
Hi,
to
James.
Jean-Michel. Following the idea that Sade shows how the excess of reason turns into unreason, I was wondering if we could consider Deleuze's difference and repetition. I'll show the second part of the question now. And the insight according to which there is an essential link between cruelty and stupidity, or beti. And I think there's another part. Could this link between cruelty and stupidity or unreason be linked to in Beckett's work, or perhaps beyond, with 20th century fascism?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Thank you, James. Yeah, Deleuze has his own particular take on Sade, and in my reading, and it's funny because I'm writing something on stupidity right now, uh, and it's not exactly Deleuzian what I'm trying to do. It's more like Lacanian reading of stupidity, which is a tricky concept because in French you have bêtise. Derrida has a whole seminar on that, on bêtise on the side of the animal. In French, la bêtise is the beast somehow. What is the beast? Is the beast ferocious or silly? That's one of the questions. But for me, what Deleuze does, and it is a very important intervention, and I'm still not sure whether I am ready to follow Deleuze. Uh, in his little book, I mean, not so short, but a very important book on Zahra Mazor, Deleuze undoes something that is a key for Freud, Klein, and classical psychoanalysis, which is this idea that you would have masochism as a reverse of sadism. Deleuze, very skillfully reading text by Sade and text by Zahra Mazor, shows that in Sade, you may have something like irony, but no humor. And in Saramazor, you would have humor and no irony. See, complicated. So basically, what he concludes is that sadism has nothing to do with masochism, that they belong to two completely different structures. Whereas in Freud, and this is completely systematic, you have this idea that sadism is the enjoyment of the pain you inflict to others, and masochism is the reverse somehow. Uh, so uh, I'm not sure whether this fits exactly with the question of stupidity. Does it fit with the question of fascism? Yes, there you have a point. Um, because this was already the point of view of Bataille, as you probably know. Bataille wrote a number of texts in the 30s in which he was hoping to use Marquis de Sade to undo the effect of fascism. It's also what you find in Geoffrey Gorer's little book. And Gorer is very political, and he shows that if you read Sade well, you understand in his time, in 1934, he talks about Stalin, he talks about Hitler, and so on, and certain state fascism. That was, I would say, Bataille's utopia with these little groups, contre-attack, and so on, of the 30s, trying to undo a certain fascism that they saw as too close to certain aims that they had. But as to the question of stupidity, I am uh, uh, I'm not sure that one could say that it is a Sadian question. I think it's more the question of the beast in the human.
Right. So maybe I'll give a few more minutes for people to type out their questions. But I have a question to kind of follow up, possibly from. So one of the things that, and I was thinking about this as you were talking, Jean-Michel, and also reading the book. So there are these moments where psychoanalysis comes in, and but it's very interesting how it sometimes comes in spite of itself, as it were. So especially with the Klossowski reading that Beckett doesn't like. That's the more explicitly psychoanalytic reading
Yeah,
that he doesn't quite like. But then you come back to this particular problematic of the mother,
yeah,
which possibly binds Beckett with
yeah,
a figure like Sade.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and there is a sort of a ghost of psychoanalysis there again coming back, as it were. But the more specific question that I had in mind, and of course you have already talked about this, but if you could talk a little bit more about exactly how Sade's vision of jouissance and this absolute jouissance that you discuss in the book, how would it uh, create a certain opening in the post-war era, and maybe continuing into the 21st century, where we live in a very different but nevertheless a very strong society of enjoyment and all kinds of perverse enjoyments as well. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that absolute jouissance in
Yeah.
Sade and how that appeals to Beckett.
I mean, thank you. Yeah. Uh, if one reconstructs this notion that is a Lacanian concept, I would say that Lacan, and he was conscious of it, owes this notion to Bataille, that when he has this idea of jouissance that is more than the Freudian pleasure, okay, since what Lacan adds to pleasure is death, in a way. This is Bataille's main idea, that he owes in part to Marquis de Sade, or the idea of combining Freud and Sade. Uh, what he saw in Sade was this pleasure in destruction, qua destruction, absolute destruction. For Bataille, it becomes a pleasure, as he calls it, joy at the instant of my death, or the fact that death has to be taken always into account in the midst of life to make life more intense and more enjoyable. And so this is what you find, this derivation from Sade, Bataille, Lacan, is for me absolutely central to understand what is happening in psychoanalysis in the 20th century. The fact that so many psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic groups in the 20th century did their best to deny the existence of the death drive, that they thought, oh, we can just credit this to Freud's Viennese pessimism. The death drive is such a horrible notion, we don't want to hear of it, and so on. And still today, it's a contested notion. Um, if we take the death drive seriously, it is part of resistance. So, as Lacan explained, the main figure structure of the drive is given to Freud by the death drive more than any other drive. So this jouissance for Lacan includes what Bataille will later call the accursed share, la part maudite, this notion of waste, of expenditure, and so on. I still believe that today we, when we talk about economy, we have to take this waste into account, or the fact that, as Bataille would always say, if you go to any big city, you will see side by side the banks and the jewel stores, the place where money is accumulated, and then the place or stores where you can buy stupid diamonds or fur coats and so on, pure waste and expenditure, see, side by side.
Think there's a question that James is putting across on behalf of Swati, because for some reason it seems like she's not able to ask the question. Right. I was wondering if Professor Rabaté could talk more about uh, okay, sorry, I'll just how Sadian's style of portraying laughter came to influence Beckett in portraying scenes of laughter in a hospital setting, for instance, in Murphy. Thank you, James, for being such a great communicator. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, because indeed it is in Murphy that we have an explicit notion of sadism when Beckett describes the personnel of the MMM, the hospital, Bim Bam Bom. We have a series of therapists who are Sadian or sadist, and indeed the hospital can be seen as another version of the castle of Selling in 120 Days of Sodom. And so this is the laughter of the torturer who can torture inmates who cannot defend themselves. So this link between laughter and a certain sadism is absolutely crucial. And here again, I would say that the thinker who has theorized this most is Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille has many intriguing pages on this idea of laughter as conveying excess, if you want. And so for Bataille, when I laugh, I touch my unreason. So I think this is the link here. We know that the plot of Murphy is partly the discovery by Murphy that unhappily he cannot become a psychotic. You have to be in a certain structure. He believes he can play chess with Mr. Hendon, that famous scene, and he discovers that Mr. Hendon is not willing to play chess with him. He just retreats and so on. So Murphy discovers the hard way that his utopia of losing his reason completely by becoming a psychotic is not possible. See, but that doesn't trigger in him laughter but panic. And so we could here compare the writing of Murphy, 1937-38 publication, with text by Bataille, written in Acéphale at exactly the same time, talking about laughter, excess, and so on. And they are absolutely congruent.
Yeah, and perhaps what makes it very interesting is this the contextual connections that we have again with Sade, where there's political censorship, there's incarceration, there's also a certain kind of uh, almost an imposition of madness to incarcerate him. I mean, he's treated for a madness that he may or may not have in any case. So there are these contexts that also bring in the clinical question. I'm just looking through. I don't think we have another question at this point. So possibly we could call it a day.
Thank
It
you
was
for your questions. I just, to conclude, what the experience of being jailed brought to Sade is the main maxim: la philosophie doit tout dire. And so it's a sort of law. Il faut tout dire. One
right,
must say everything, which
right.
I think is a key to a certain modernity.
Mm,
If we look at the way Rancière, for instance, understands the evolution of the novel in his excellent mute speech, Jacques Rancière, he shows that the novel slowly uh, can absorb everything and can say everything. This was the discovery of Joyce for
yeah,
and of Proust for Beckett, that writing can say absolutely everything and there's no limit. This derives from Marquis de Sade. You see, this idea that philosophy and writing, because for him, he's not a philosopher, he's a writer, must say everything. And so, in that sense, I think that Sade is absolutely a precursor of a certain modernity, even
mm,
though he is a little impenetrable, he's a sort of pornographer, and is often a boring writer. Nevertheless, you have this ethical injunction, il faut tout dire, which I think
right.
still today has revolutionary potential in so many
Yeah, and
countries.
it's almost like an ethics of freedom of expression, and especially
Exactly,
21st
exactly,
century when we are again
exactly,
struggling with freedom of expression sometimes
exactly,
around questions of democracy, it
absolutely.
remains a very important question. But
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
same time, just to maybe make one final comment on that, because I remember highlighting that part in your book where you mentioned that particular injunction. What is also interesting in a writer like Beckett is, on the one hand, everything must be said, but he's also a writer who would acknowledge that there cannot be a totalization and not everything can ever be said, even though an attempt has to be made. So it's very interesting kind of a paradox that way.
I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, that's also the basic Lacanian motto. When Lacan begins his television, I always tell the truth, but not the whole truth.
yeah.
you
The
cannot
beauty of
you
it. Yeah,
cannot say all the truth, but you should stick to the injunction to say all the truth, even though you know you cannot say all the truth.
right, right. It's like the ending of the unnameable. I mean, you must go on. I
Exactly,
can't go on. I'll
exactly,
go.
exactly.
I think
Yeah, yeah.
that's a great injunction to end with, because we will also go on. And thank you
Your
so
pleasure.
much for your time, for your
Thank you for your time and your attention. And
it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much
thank
to
you.
everyone who
Thank you.
joined in.
Yes, sir.
And
Welcome.
so, bye bye. Bye. Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.